Yet. There we go. Thank you, Cecilia. So good. Okay, so let's get started here. The first thing I want to talk about is what courses should you be taking? So if you're just getting started, or even if you're a little more advanced, what courses should you be taking? There's a bunch of Latin courses, but they're not all the same and they're not all as important as each other. So the most important class, I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me a second. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a wave if you can see my screen right now, just so I know. Can you see my screen? Okay, good. Okay, so you can see there's a bunch of Latin courses available, and which course should you take? The most important course for you getting started is Latin Reading 1. That's the most important course, okay? And what I'd like you to think about is, most of you obviously can read and speak and understand English. And you didn't learn English by taking grammar courses. You learned English by just being in an English-speaking family. You just started hearing English. Your parents spoke to you, your siblings spoke to you. Maybe you watched television shows or listened to music, whatever. You just learned English by listening to it and slowly learning to use the language yourself. So the first way that we learn language is just by being immersed in a language. And when we're studying a foreign language, especially a classical language, the best way to immerse ourselves in the language is not by trying to speak it, but by reading it. That's the way that we immerse ourselves in classical languages, especially. Maybe if you're surrounded by Spanish-speaking people, you can immerse yourself in Spanish language, or some people travel to other countries to immerse themselves in those languages by just, living among the people and learning little by little. But when you get to classical languages, not only can you not do that, you can't go to Rome and immerse yourself in classical Latin, so it doesn't work. And there are some people who try to teach Latin by speaking Latin, but it's really not as good for you as just immersing yourself in real Latin reading, not fake Latin reading, not Latin books designed for new students and stuff like that, but just immersing yourself in real Latin reading that you already know in English, so that you can focus on the Latin language. And that's what we do in the Latin reading course. We start reading the Latin Bible. We read the Gospel of John in Latin. And the whole goal there is just to immerse yourself in real Latin, not fake Latin, not school Latin, but real Latin. So Latin Reading 1 is the most important course for you getting started, and that's the course you should spend the most time in. And I'm going to show you how to study the Latin Reading course so that you get the most out of it. But the goal is just to immerse yourself in real Latin reading, to learn the vocabulary, to learn what sentences look like in Latin, and just get comfortable reading and translating Latin, okay? Real Latin, not fake Latin. There are a lot of books that are produced where they're sort of like fake Latin for new students. There's no use wasting your time with that stuff. You can go right into real Latin. And our course, our Latin reading course, will help you to learn it. So the most important course is Latin reading. You'll learn tons of vocabulary because in every lesson we read like 5 lines of Latin. There are usually 50 or 60 words in each lesson at least. And when you begin, all of them are new words. And then as you go on, each lesson there's fewer and fewer new words. So your vocabulary builds slowly. That's a good thing. But also, because you're reading the Gospel of John, you also develop a Christian vocabulary. So you learn all of the important Christian words in Latin, which helps you to understand prayers, which helps you to read other books of the Bible, to understand hymns that you might see in church and things like that. So our first goal is to develop a Christian vocabulary in Latin, because that's useful right away for all of us. And then as you get further along in our Latin courses, into Latin Reading 2 and 3, we'll get into classical Latin. So you'll start to build more of a Roman vocabulary. So you just have to be patient. We'll build our vocabulary over time. And what's most important when you build your vocabulary is that you build your vocabulary in the real language. So for example, if you were to take a word like bird, just any word, take bird or tree, you might look up in a dictionary and find out that there's 6 different words in Latin that mean bird, or 7 different words that mean tree. And you can't just pick any one you want. You know, the Roman people, when they pointed to a tree and said tree, they used a certain word, and the other words were usually used for different things. So you can't just look up words in a dictionary and think that that's how Latin works. You've got to learn words in their context, you know, in the right places, how they were actually used. And by reading, we're able to do that. So we'll start with Christian Latin in the Gospel of St. John, and then we'll move on to Roman Latin. In Latin reading 2, we'll read the works of Cicero, who was a famous Roman lawyer and philosopher. And then in Latin reading 3, if you get that far, we'll read Latin poetry, which is a little more difficult. So we'll learn tons of vocabulary in context with real Latin reading over time. You just need to be patient and develop one lesson at a time, one step at a time. But Latin reading is the most important course, and you will build a huge vocabulary by Latin reading. The other good thing about Latin reading is that you've got to have some sentences and real Latin language already in mind before you start studying Latin grammar, because if you study Latin grammar by itself, it'll just be a bunch of random information. Whereas if you're already in Latin reading and you start to learn Latin grammar, you'll immediately be able to think of examples of all of the stuff that you learn in Latin grammar. So it's best to start with Latin reading, get a few lessons in Latin reading, and then start Latin grammar, okay? The other course that's important is Latin vocabulary. Now, this vocabulary is different because let's just say you're curious about Latin and you'd like to learn lots of Latin words. Well, in the Latin vocabulary course, each lesson presents one topic, like, you know, like the earth, and then it's as if you're looking out the window and you'd like to learn the names of everything you see outside. That Latin vocabulary course introduces a topic and then teaches you a bunch of vocabulary that relates to that topic. And it moves through all kinds of topics lesson by lesson. So if you're just interested in learning lots of Latin words and building Latin vocabulary about all different subjects, you can use the Latin vocabulary course to do that. But I wouldn't let the Latin vocabulary course get in the way of your Latin reading course. So if you're making lots of progress in Latin reading and you start getting bored of doing the same Latin reading lessons all the time, you can take a break and do a vocabulary lesson to sort of, you know, get some fresh new Latin stuff. But we want to always stay focused on Latin reading. And then we want to add Latin grammar and here and there as sort of a break or some fun, you know. I don't know how fun that really is, but just as a break from the normal routine of Latin reading, you can do some Latin vocabulary study and just study the vocabulary for topics that you're interested in. Okay. Also, with that vocabulary course, you're free to jump around. So if you look at the titles of the lessons in Latin vocabulary and you see a topic that looks really interesting, you can do that lesson. You don't have to start at the beginning and work one lesson at a time. You can bounce around and pick a lesson that looks interesting to just learn the vocabulary that you'd actually like to learn. Whereas Latin reading and Latin grammar, you've got to start at lesson 1 and work one lesson at a time. That's not true for Latin vocabulary. Okay, so for most of you, almost all of you, you should be focused on Latin reading, and you should eventually be adding Latin grammar. Now, let me say one thing about Latin grammar before we move on. This year, I'm using a different textbook for Latin grammar, and there's a couple reasons why. Previously, really for the last 15 years, you know, as long as I've been teaching Latin grammar, I've taught Latin grammar from an old Latin book that was actually written in Latin. And the problem with that is that it requires me to translate it into Latin, into English, sorry. And that just takes some time, and students haven't made very good progress with that course. So what I did this year to make it much easier for all of you, to allow you to make progress a lot faster is I've replaced that course with a new Latin grammar course. So you can see on my screen here, there's a Latin grammar and it says closed. That's the old course that I'm going to be closing. It's still open so students can sort of finish up where they're at, but I've opened a new Latin grammar course that's going to make Latin grammar a lot easier for all of you. Plus, since I don't have to spend time translating the whole textbook into English, it leaves time for me to make videos to help you. So if you go in that Latin grammar course, you'll see that I'm already making lesson videos for each lesson, and the videos will make things really easy for you. And we'll be able to move pretty quickly and easily through Latin grammar. So it's a new course that's going to be much easier than the old course was. And I recommend that new course for everyone because we've got to get through Latin grammar and learn as much as we can. And we've got to make it as easy as possible. We might have goals for what we'd like to do, the perfect Latin program, but the reality is there are so few people studying and learning Latin today that we've just got to get through the language and become comfortable with Latin. So I'd like to help you do that. And I'd like to spend more time making videos to help you. And I can do that now in that new Latin grammar course. So just to look at it real quick, you can see that for every lesson, for I think the first 7 or 8 lessons, you'll see that there's a video prelection. And in that video prelection, I'll see if I can open this up real quick. You'll see that there's a video that walks you through the lesson. Let's just take a look at this real quick if I can play it. You might not be able to hear this, but that's okay. So you'll see I just walk you through the text for the lesson and explain everything that we see in the lesson, and that'll make the study really easy for you. Okay, so Latin Grammar 1, you'll have videos for each lesson as we go through. And if you've been studying in the old Latin grammar course, obviously you don't want to start all over from the beginning, and you don't need to. So we simply need to find out where you are in terms of the content, and we can help get you started at the right place. So just contact me and I'll help you with that. Okay, so most important is Latin reading. After you get a few lessons into Latin reading, you can get into Latin grammar, and it'll be helpful because you already have Latin to think about. Plus, as you learn grammar little by little and you get into new Latin reading lessons, you'll start to see all of that grammar, and it will help you to understand what's going on in the Latin reading. And then if you want to break, or let's say over the summer, you take a break from your normal studies, you can spend the summer studying Latin vocabulary. So that's how you should think about those courses and use them. But you've got to focus on Latin reading. That's the most important thing. You've got to immerse yourself in real Latin. Okay, so what I'd like to do for the rest of our time today is walk you through a Latin reading lesson to show you what to do. So let's just take a look at this. And those of you who already know how to do this, just be patient with us. And you can help me out with some of the translation work in a minute. So in Latin reading, I present you with 5 verses from the Gospel of John. Many of you probably have already seen this. I give you the Latin text from the Gospel. There's no changes to it. It's not made easier or anything like that. It's real Latin, straight out of the Latin Bible. And I provide you with a word-by-word translation from Latin into English for the whole lesson. And then you've got to study that lesson to learn all the vocabulary. So you've got to study the Latin word and learn the English translation. In order to help you, we have these translation exercises. For translation exercises, you copy out the Latin and then you translate each word one at a time. Now, when you get started, you're going to have to look at the lessons for help. So the first few times you do it, you should copy out the Latin, one word at a time, and then write the English meaning of that word, write the next word, write the English meaning, and so on until you're done with the whole reading. You need to repeat that a couple times a day, maybe, or every day. Repeat that until you don't need to look at the lesson anymore. So you really start to learn the vocabulary. Maybe there's a few words you need to look back and check, but after you practice those translation exercises again and again, you repeat them, you'll start to be able to write out the translation without needing to look at the lesson. And you should continue doing that until you can finally write out the whole translation without looking at the lesson anymore. That's when you know you're done. You're done when you can write out the translation without needing to look at the lesson. Now, the first lesson is going to be very hard and it's going to take a long time because all of the words are new. So the first lesson is going to take a long time. But when you get to lesson 2, many of the words will be familiar because you already learned them in lesson 1. So lesson 2 will be easier. Then when you get to lesson 3, you'll know even more words. So lesson 3 will be easier and lesson 4 will be easier. And after a while, you'll start to get the lessons done pretty quickly and easily. And finally, when we get through around chapter 4, there's hardly any new vocabulary, and you can just quickly do the translation exercises. And that's when we know that we're done with Latin Reading 1. So if you start the first lesson and it seems really difficult and slow, that's normal because all the words are new. But as you go on, it'll get faster and faster until it becomes easy. And that's when it's time to move on to a new author and a new book, and we'll move on to Latin Reading 2. So just be patient when you get started. It might be very, very hard at first, but it gets easier. It's just because you don't know the words yet. So just be patient. But you've got 2 sets of exercises to do, and you can see them on the lesson page here. You've got Latin to English translation exercises where you copy out the Latin and then write the English meaning. And then you've got English to Latin translation where you do the other way around. You copy the English and then write the Latin translation. Now, this isn't a method that I invented. This is actually how ancient Romans taught people how to study the language. Cicero, who was, as I said before, an ancient Roman philosopher and teacher and speaker and lawyer, he's considered the greatest Latin master to ever live, Cicero. This is how he taught people to learn languages. It's how he taught his son to learn the Greek language, by just taking, texts in the original language, copying them out, and then writing translations, and then flipping it into the other order, writing out your own language, and then translating it back into the original language, and then comparing your translation to the actual language of the master of the language that you're working with. So it allows us to test ourselves in both directions, and that's why we use these exercises in our Latin reading course. And then after you've done the Latin and English translation exercises, there's usually a vocabulary quiz in each lesson. The vocabulary quiz will be really difficult if you don't do the translation exercises, because the quiz is going to test exactly what's in the lesson. So you might see a word that you've learned before or heard before, but it doesn't mean exactly in the lesson what you might have learned it to mean. And you'll get those quiz questions marked wrong because this quiz is based on our lesson. It's not based on what you might have heard elsewhere. So do the translation exercises, follow the lesson in terms of what I give you as the translation, and that will help you to prepare for the quiz. Okay, so that's what a normal lesson in Latin reading looks like. And like I said, if you do these lessons and you do them the right way, you don't cheat or skip or you quit before you've actually finished being able to translate without looking. If you cut corners and skip steps and just try to get through the quiz and finish, you're not going to learn it. So be patient, do everything as you're instructed, and this will lead you to mastery of the Latin language. What I'd like to do is walk through 2 of these translation exercises so you can see exactly what we do. So let's go ahead and look at that. I'm going to share on my screen. I've already prepared one of these. So you can see this is a Google Doc that I've prepared to do my Latin to English translation. You can see I've labeled it Lesson 1, John 1, 1 through 5. And then I just use the letters LEX to stand for Latin to English translation. Okay. And I've copied the Latin text here from the lesson to make it easy for myself. And now what I'm going to do is, if I was completing the Latin to English translation exercise, I'm just going to write the English translation for each Latin word. Now, if you're just getting started, you're going to need to look at the lesson to help you to do this. But obviously, I don't need to look at the lesson, I've been studying Latin for 25 years, but what I'm going to do as we go through this is I'm just going to ask you for the words. And those of you who have experience with these lessons and have studied them, you can just text me the answers in the text chat and we'll move through it. And that'll give everybody a chance to, you can consider this like a little bit of a quiz challenge. All right. So let's just go through this. And this is what I would do to complete this exercise. So the first word we have in, what does in mean? Just give me the answers. Good. So we have in. Don't jump ahead. Don't be annoying and try to be a show off and jump ahead. Just follow me here, okay? Follow me. So we have in. In means in. That's pretty simple. Then we have principio. What does principio mean? Beginning. Very good. Now, in the Bible, we'll see that it means in the beginning, but the word the is not in Latin, doesn't exist in Latin. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the word the in parentheses because it doesn't actually come from the Latin. And then we'll type beginning. So we have in principio, and I'll make these red so it's easier to see them. We're just going to take our time and go through this. I'll make these red. So in the beginning, then we have the word erat. What does erat mean? Very good. It means was. It's a verb. Now notice this gets a little confusing because the verb erat can mean he was, can mean she was, can mean it was, right? So there's sort of a person in this verb, and we're going to find out who that person is later in the sentence. But when you take a quiz, this can get very confusing because when you take a quiz, should you write it was? Should you write he was? Should you just leave the person out and just write was? Usually on the quiz is designed to allow for a couple different answer possibilities. So that shouldn't be a problem. But if you want to, you can just stick to the simple verb. Okay, that should be okay for the quizzes. All right, the next word we have verbum. What does verbum mean? It means the word. And again, the word the as it isn't actually in the Latin, so we'll put that in parentheses and then add word. Okay, so there we go. So we've got the Latin here for this first phrase, in principio. And those of you who are just getting started, just listen to get comfortable with the pronunciation. You can just listen to my pronunciation. And again, this is Christian Latin, so it's a little different than classical Latin. So we've got to learn both ways of pronouncing. And we read whatever we're reading. If the author was an ancient Roman, we read his writing with classical pronunciation. If it's Christian writing, we read that with Christian pronunciation. So some people say, which pronunciation should we use? It depends who's writing. It depends what we're reading. If it's classical Latin, then read it with classical pronunciation. If it's Christian writing, then read it with Christian pronunciation. Okay, so the first phrase here, we have in principio erat verbum. In principio erat verbum, and we've got the translation. In the beginning was the word. So that's all you need to do, but we'll keep going here. We'll just work through this whole passage together. So next up, we have the word et. What does et mean? Et means and, good. So et means and, so we enter that in there. And then this is what I'm talking about when I say, as you get going with these lessons, the vocabulary repeats. And so while it's slow in the beginning when you're learning the vocabulary for the first time, you start to see the words again and again and again, and it gets easier and easier. So here we see the word verbum again. We've already seen that word in the previous phrase. So we've got verbum again, means the word. Very good. Oops. So let me just put this in parentheses. Just bear with me. I'm going to go slow here. So we have the word again. Notice again, we've got the verb erat, and we've already seen that. So this is a word now that we've already seen. So that's easy. We know that that means was. Now we have a new word, apud. What does apud mean? Very good. Apud means with. It's a preposition. It means with. And in the lesson tells you the parts of speech. You don't need to know the parts of speech in Latin Reading 1, but you should still pay attention to them so that you can start learning what part of speech each word is. That's going to be important later in Latin reading too. And then we've got the noun Deum. What does Deum mean? Good, it means God. And so we've translated our second phrase now. So now we've got in principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, apud Deum, with God. Okay? So let's move on. Once again, we now see a word that we've already seen in this lesson. So that gets easier. What does et mean? Et means and. Very good. Who can tell me what part of speech et is? What part of speech is et? Jackson asked, do we do this assessment each day? You should think of this as an exercise to repeat and repeat and repeat until you can finally do it with no help. So whether you repeat it 5 times in one day and get it done, that's fine. Or if you do it once or twice a day and it takes you a whole week, that it doesn't matter. The goal is just to repeat this following your own family schedule. I don't know how much time you have for Latin studies. Just to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until you don't need to look at your lesson. You know all the words, you know what they mean, and you can just write out the translation, okay? Very good. Everyone's saying that and is a conjunction. That's right. And then we've got the word Deus. What does Deus mean? God. Very good. Okay, now let's pay attention to some differences here, okay? We see here the word Deus, and that looks familiar because in the last phrase, we saw the word Deum. So we can see that these words are similar, but they're not the same. And this is what makes Latin special as you start learning the language. You start to see that words have different forms. We don't do this in English, so this is something you have to learn in Latin. We see the words have different forms. Now, in the lesson, sometimes I'll explain what the different forms mean, but sometimes they really don't have a different meaning in English. You'll understand what these different forms mean when you study Latin grammar. So this is why it's good for us to get started with Latin reading, run into some confusing problems because we don't understand what's going on, have those problems in our minds, and then begin studying grammar and find the explanations for the things that we don't understand in Latin reading. So that's why I say start with Latin reading, get some experience in reading. You'll find quite a bit of stuff that you really don't understand, but you learn from the lesson. And then when you study grammar, you'll start to understand exactly what's going on in the Latin reading. So these two words are different forms of the same word, and you'll learn what the forms mean in Latin grammar. Then we have the verb erat again. What does erat mean? Erat means was. So that's the third time now we've seen the same word. And then again, we've got verbum again. We already know that means the word. So we've seen that 3 times now. You guys are doing pretty good giving me the meanings. So just stick with me though, don't jump ahead, because if you start jumping ahead, we'll have all kinds of answers mixed up and it'll be a mess. So just stick with me, okay? So now we've got this whole first verse finished. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum. And we've translated every single word. Now, the reason why I make you translate every single word is because what students will often do, because we already know what this means in English. We've already maybe read this in a Latin Bible, or we've heard it at Mass. If you go to a Latin Mass, sometimes at the end of Mass, they say the first verses of the Gospel of John at the end of Mass. So you hear this Latin, and you may just know it from the English Bible. And what students will do is they'll kind of cheat a little bit and just sort of translate the ideas or just write the English that they remember instead of actually translating every word. And what I want you to do is learn to translate every single word. I want you to be able to look at a word and immediately give its translation. Look at the next word and give its translation. Because if you were a child in ancient Rome and someone was talking to you in Latin, The child didn't listen to the whole sentence and then start looking around to find the subject and then find the verb. And then no one ever understood Latin like that. So when some programs teach you to translate that like that, it doesn't make any sense. No one ever read or understood Latin that way. They heard it one word at a time and they understood the meaning, just like we do in English. So we have to practice translating one word at a time, or else we'll never be able to read Latin. So that's why I make you translate one word at a time like this. It proves that you actually understand the meaning of each word. And that's what actually allows you to learn to translate and understand the language, okay? So I'm not just being annoying, I'm actually showing you how to translate it realistically, okay? All right, so let's go, verse 2. I'm going to read the verse real quick so you hear the Latin. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. And what I want you to see here in verse 2 is you already know every word in this sentence except the first word. So if you translated and studied verse 1, you already have seen all of the words in verse 2 except for the word hoc. So that's what I mean when I say the translation work will get easier and easier as you go. So what does the word hoc mean? This, and you guys are starting to jump ahead of me. Don't do that. Just wait for me. It means this. Very good. So this, and I'll put it in uppercase because it's the first word of the sentence. So this, and then we've got this whole phrase here. We already know all these words. So I'm just going to type them. We know erat means was. I'll make that red. We know in principio means in the beginning. Put that in parentheses because it's not in the Latin. And just bear with me as I change these colors to make it clear. Then we have apud, which means with, and Deum means God. So that's verse 2, very easy because we already know all the words from verse 1. Now we get into verse 3 and we've got a lot of new vocabulary. So this verse is going to be a little more difficult. It's going to take some more time. So just to read the verse first, you should always read the whole verse before you start translating. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum est nihil quod factum est. So verse 3, the word omnia, what does that mean? Omnia, very good, all things. It means all things. You could also translate it as everything, but it's better to follow exactly the translation that I teach you in the lesson. There's reasons why I give you the translation that I do. So if you say, oh, well, I know that word, it means everything. Don't do that because you're going to see I give you the translation for a reason. So omnia means all things. Then we have a preposition, per. What does per mean? All things through. Very good. So we can see who's done these lessons before. All things per ipsum. What does per ipsum, or what does ipsum mean? Him. Very good. So we have ipsum, and then we've got this. This is a participle, facta. Facta. What does facta mean? You can think of the English word factory, right? A factory is a place where things are made. You can think of the word manufacture. Manufacture means to make something by hand. So here we see the origin of those English words. It means made. That's good. And then we have a verb sunt. What does sunt mean? Are. Very good. It's a verb that means they are. Now let me show you one more little grammar lesson while we have it here. Notice that back up in, actually we didn't see this word yet, so I'll hold off on that. So we have sunt, which means are. So verse 3 says, all things through him made are. Now, when you read that, it might sound a little funny because the word order in Latin isn't the same as English. And some people will start moving words all around and stuff like that to try to make it sound like normal English. But my advice is don't do that. The Roman people, the people who spoke Latin, they didn't do that. They didn't move all the words around to make sense. It does make sense. You just have to learn to think in terms of ideas as they were presented in Latin. And if you learn to think like this, if you learn to think in Latin word order, it'll help you to translate more quickly in the future because you'll be able to think the way that the Latin speakers thought. So don't move words around when you translate. Translate it in the exact word order. It might be a little bit awkward when you get started, but after a while, you'll get used to it, and that will make your translation work easier. So just listen to the English, listen to the word order as it is in Latin. So follow me here. Starting in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. Pretty simple. Verse 2, this was in the beginning with God. Pretty simple. Verse 3, all things through him made are. Now that's a little bit different from English, but it's still easy to understand, and you'll just get used to it as we go along. So don't move words around when you translate, okay? Keep them in their original word order. Let's keep going here. The word et, what does et mean? We've already seen this word. Very good. It means and. And then we have a preposition, sine. What does sine mean? Very good. It means without. Now, if you're new to this class and you see these other students just firing away all these answers, don't think that they're brilliant and you're dumb or something. They've been studying this course for time already, and they've just learned this by doing these exercises, okay? So don't think that there's something wrong with you if you don't know these meanings. So sine means without, and then we've got ipso. What does ipso mean? Him. Very good. Okay. Now notice again here, we've got this word ipso, and it looks familiar because before we saw ipsum. So these are two different forms of the same word. What you're going to learn, and I don't want to make this confusing by introducing too much information, but you'll see that this preposition here, per, is always followed by one form, ipsum, and this preposition, sine, is followed by a different form. So there's grammar reasons for why these different forms are there. When you're getting started in Latin reading, you can't understand that, but I don't want you to worry about that because when we get into Latin grammar, you'll begin to understand what all that stuff means. So don't worry about that now. Just learn the lessons. We're going to study that in grammar, okay? Next up, we have factum. What does factum mean? Some of you are cheating a little bit. Remember, if you start a race early, you get disqualified. So wait until I shoot the gun. So we have factum, and that should look familiar because we've already seen the word facta. So we've got two different forms of the same word. It means made here. Then we've got the verb est. What does est mean? Est means is. Very simple. Okay, est means is. And then we've got this noun, which means what? What does nihil mean? Nihil means nothing. That's right. If any of you watch soccer, or I should say football, if you live in other countries, you'll know that sometimes when a team has no goals or no points, they'll refer to their score as nil. That's a form of the word nihil. It means nothing, okay? So if one team is winning 3 goals to nothing, they'll say 3 goals to nil. It's from this word nihil, okay? It means nothing. So we've got verse 3, omnia per ipsum facta sunt et sine ipso factum est nihil quod factum est. And we've translated just about all of it. We've got one phrase left. Quod, what does quod mean? Quod means that. Very good. And again, all these answers are in the lesson. So if you don't know them, it's just because you haven't studied the lesson yet. And then we've got factum est again, which we just translated up here, factum est. So the same phrase, factum means made, and est means is. Okay, so that's good. So we've got verse 3 all translated. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum est nihil, quod factum est. All things through him made are, and without him made is nothing that made is. So we see that word order is a little bit weird in English, but it makes perfect sense. So we don't need to move things around. Let me give you one quick tip on pronunciation. When you are reading words in Latin, anytime you have a word with two syllables, like nihil or ipsum or facta, anytime you have a word with two syllables, the first syllable is always accented. All right, so just to have a general rule for how to read these words, if you see the word ipsum, you translate it with stress on the first syllable. Ipsum, facta, nihil. All right, so anytime you have a word with two syllables, accent the first syllable. That's the right way to pronounce the word. Anytime you have a word with just one syllable, there is no accent. So keep that simple rule in mind. Let's get to verse 4. Verse 4 reads, in ipso vita erat, et vita erat lux hominum. The preposition in, what does in mean? What does in mean? Good. In means in, pretty simple. Let me make it red. Then we've got ipso, which we've seen before. Ipso means him. Very good. Then we've got a new word, vita. What does vita mean? Vita means life. If you get into an accident or go to the hospital for some reason, the first thing that the nurse will do is check your vital signs. What does the word vital mean? Comes from this Latin word, vita. What does vital mean? You can't say vitals because that's the word. What does the word vital mean? What are vital signs? They're signs of life. Very good. Okay, they're life signs. So they check your breathing, they check your pulse, they make sure your blood pressure is okay. They check the signs of life, right? They check your living signs. So vita means life. We also have the word vitamin in English. Vitamin is sort of like a, you can see by calling it a vitamin, it's some sort of substance necessary for life. All right. Then we've got the verb erat, which we've already seen a few times, so I'll just write that in. That's easy for us. We've got the conjunction et again, which we've already seen. We know that means and. Then we've got the noun vita again. What does vita mean? Vita means life. So we see that again. Then we've got erat again. What does erat mean? Erat means was. Very good. Then we've got a new word here, lux. What does the word lux mean? Light. Very good. So lux means light. And then we've got another new word, hominum. What does hominum mean? Of man. That's not exactly right. Be careful. Not of man. You've got to be really careful to stick to the translation in the lesson. So these little details make a difference. It's not of man, it's of men. Okay, so just be careful there. Of men, it's plural, it's of men. So now listen to this, listen to verse 4. In ipso vita erat, et vita erat lux hominum. In him life was, and life was light of men. Okay, that's our English translation, very simple. Now, those of you who have studied the language, who have studied the lesson already, what did we leave out in there? We left out a couple simple things in the translation. In him life was, and life was light of men. What did we leave out? Anybody know? Good, Jackson, right. The word the, all right? So the translation actually reads, in him life was, and the life. Fix this real quick. And the life was the light of men. So those little notes will be in the lesson, and they're just added in to make the English clearer. Because in Latin, again, in Latin, there's no word for the. So in English, we use the word the. We've got to add it in to make it sound like English. But in Latin, they don't have a word for the. All right. And then lastly, verse 5. We'll stop here and not do verse 5 actually, because I want to spend a couple minutes looking at the English to Latin translation. So that was very good. Everyone was very helpful. Let's look at what the English to Latin translation exercise looks like. So here you can see I've already written the English, and we're just going to do the same thing in the opposite direction. So the English word in, how do we translate that into Latin? Very simple, we just use in. Okay, and I'll make this red. So we'll keep the Latin clear here. Then we have the phrase the beginning, and the is in parentheses. So that tells us we don't need to translate that, just beginning. So what's the translation for beginning? Principio. Very good. Now, what some students might do if you're sloppy or you're trying to rush, you might, instead of typing principio, you might type another form of the word like principium. The reason why these exercises are helpful is because you can, after you're done, you can compare your translation to the original Latin and catch little mistakes like that and clean them up. So that's really the purpose of these exercises, to give you the chance to translate English into Latin and then compare your translation in Latin with the original Latin text, okay? Then we've got the English verb was. How do we translate was? We've got erat. Very good. I'll make that red. Then we've got the word, and we see that we don't need to translate the word the, just word. So how do we translate that? We've got verbum. Very good. Then we've got the word and. How do we translate and? Et. Then we've got the word again, which is easy because we just did that. So we'll put verbum there. Then we've got was again. What's was? You guys can just keep up with me now because I'm moving pretty quick here. Erat. And then we've got with God. How do we say with? Apud. Very good. Apud. And then God here. Deus, right? We've got apud Deus, right? Am I right there? Does our translation look good? Some of you are writing Deum. That's right. So this is another example where that would be wrong, and we need to correct it and get exactly the right form of the word. So very good. You caught me there. Okay, so we've got our translation. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum. And then we can compare that to the lesson and see that it's exactly right. So that's how you'll do the English to Latin exercises. And just like the other ones, you want to repeat these exercises until you can do it without looking at your lesson for any help, okay? So that's it. That's how the exercises get done. And then if you type the exercises, you can just get finished and then copy this and paste it and submit it as an assignment. If you do them by hand, sometimes it's more fun doing these by hand, especially if you study Greek, because it's a real difficult task to type Greek. So if you're going to study Greek, you should do that by hand anyway. You can just use a smartphone to scan your work and submit a link to that scan, okay? So that's how we do the translation exercises, and you just need to continue them until you've got them mastered. And then once you've done the translation exercises and you've got them mastered, well, then the quiz should be pretty easy. So let's look at this quiz real quick. So if we take this quiz, now we're not going to know all these words because there's some from verse 5 that we didn't look at, but let's just take a walk through here. You can see the quiz is very easy now. What does verbum mean? Word. And so once you get through your translation exercises, this is from verse 5, so you might not know this one. It's it. We've got in principio, you should know that. And again, you may wonder, well, on the quiz, do I need to put the, do I need to put it in parentheses? The answer is no. Normally, you can just enter a simple translation and that will be okay. So once you go through the translation exercises and you master the translation exercises, these quizzes will be easy. If you try to do these quizzes without doing the translation work, it'll be difficult. But if you do it the right way, it'll all be pretty easy. Okay, so that's really a complete guide for how to study the Latin reading lessons. Everything you need to know to do well in Latin reading, we've just gone over and I've shown you how to do it. That's really easy. It's okay. We don't need to worry about those. And again, the reason why some of those words might have been different or difficult was because we didn't translate verse 5 and some of the quiz questions were from verse 5. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So that's it. We've gone over what a lesson looks like in Latin reading. I think that should make it pretty clear for what you need to do. There's lots of different ways you can do it, though. You can see I typed it in a Google Doc. You can do it by hand if you want to. You can also use these exercises for handwriting exercise to practice writing neatly. So there's lots of different ways you can do the exercises, but that's what needs to get done. And all that matters in the end is that you master the translations. You can do them without any help. And then to complete the assignment here on your lesson, I'll just open this real quick. It doesn't let me submit an assignment because I'm the teacher, but to submit the assignment, you can either just copy and paste your translation work, or you can send me a link to a scan of your handwritten work or whatever you'd like to do. But that's what you need to do to finish lessons in Latin Reading 1. Once you get the hang of it, it'll get easier and easier. You'll be able to move faster and faster. So just be patient in the first lesson, work through it, do everything the right way. Don't try to rush or cut corners. Follow the instructions. And when I see your work, I'll give you a score. But I'm going to be trusting, and here's the problem with grading. I'm going to trust that you've worked on this translation exercise until it was mastered. If you don't do that, if you just do it one time, look at the lesson for your answers and submit it, you're just cheating yourself because you're not learning the lesson. I don't know whether you've done it right or not. So I'm going to grade your translation exercise, but that doesn't mean that you actually followed instructions. Only you know if you followed the instructions. So you're going to have to make sure you study for mastery. We're going to know in the end, because if you didn't study for mastery, when we get to Latin Reading 2, you're going to have no idea what to do. Plus, it's going to be very slow for you because you're never going to learn the vocabulary. So you're going to get caught eventually. And so take your time, do it the right way, and you'll get faster little by little. All right. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I took almost the whole time, but fortunately, I think that's a helpful guide through the lesson to show you how to do everything. If you have any questions or would like to chat about anything with Latin studies, we can do that now. Just text me your questions. If you've got to go because your time is up and you've got other things to do, you're free to go now. I'm not going to introduce anything new, and anything we talk about in the chat will be available in the recording, so you can check it out later if you want to. Okay, so for those of you who have to leave, thanks for coming. I'll see you next time. And for those of you who want to hang around with any questions, I'll stay here until the questions dry up. Okay, so fire away in the text chat and we'll get going here. Why are you telling us some of the quiz answers? It's not a secret, right? I've already told you all the quiz answers in the lesson, so you've still got to answer them for yourself. It's not cheating for a teacher to tell you the answers. That's what we do. You've got to answer the quiz on your own, though, and hopefully you can do that. I'm not trying to catch you and make you fail. I'm trying to help you get perfect scores. All right, so that's that. Let's see. Okay, looks like a bunch of students are leaving, so that's okay. If I'm a little glitchy on your side, it's probably your internet connection because my internet connection is very, very fast. So you can probably see somewhere on your screen where it shows you the quality of your connection. I don't know, but maybe. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're all welcome. I'll see you guys next week. My brother wants to know why Latin was made. Yeah, questions like that are really interesting. Like, where did all these languages come from? Did some guy just sit around and randomly create his own language? Where did the languages come from? It's a good question. I don't necessarily know that. Now we have, we know the Bible story of the Tower of Babel, right? Where it says that God confused language among people. I'm not sure. I don't think I've ever really even thought about that much, and it would probably make my brain hurt if I tried to figure out where the languages came from. So I'm not sure. George writes, or Gemma writes, where is Latin mostly used? Well, today Latin is mostly used in the church for Christian Latin, and then in colleges and universities. A lot of important writings have never been translated, and so scholars who work in ancient history and stuff like they have to be able to read Latin and Greek because they need to study the old work. So I'm what's called a classicist. I study classical languages, classical literature, ancient history, and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that I have to read in Latin and Greek because it's never been translated. So people still read and use Latin and Greek. It's obviously used in the church still, but we don't walk around, at the grocery store speaking in Latin. But it is still used in religion and in history studies and language studies and things like that. Okay, so that's a good question. I saw another one here. If there are 7 Latin words for one English word, how do you choose which one to use? That's a great question. So I said that before. I said, if you just use a dictionary, you might find that there's 10 different words for one idea. Just think about this. Imagine if somebody came to America, I'm in America. Some of you I know are not in America, but I'm in America. Imagine if somebody came from China to America and they didn't know how to say many things because they were just learning English, but they had a dictionary that was an English to Chinese dictionary. And so they could look up an English word, and then there would be a bunch of words in English that have that meaning. It would be pretty funny because the Chinese person would use words that we really don't use, right? So for example, for like let's say a muffin or something like that, he might call it cake, or he might call it a biscuit, or he might call it a cookie because he doesn't know what the exact word is that we use. Or even if we go to different places, if I go to England, they may refer to, a biscuit as a cookie. I think they do. Whereas for us, a cookie is like a dessert. It's like a little treat. So even though we have the same words, or even though the same idea has different words that could be used, we just don't use those words, right? There's common words that we use every day in different places at different times. And so if you just look words up in a dictionary and think that that's really not how the language works. You would sound like a crazy person if people spoke that language. So what we do is we study what's called usage, right? Usage is how people actually use those words in that language. And for us, what we do is we actually study classical languages, classical authors or Christian authors, and we see what words they actually used in different places to mean different things. And so that's how we decide which word is the right word to use based on how masters of the language use that word. So that's the difference between real Latin and some kind of goofy Latin that people make up by looking words up in a dictionary, okay? So we look to the masters of the language and see how they used it. Is the Duolingo Latin course real Latin? Duolingo is good if you just want to learn some vocabulary. The Duolingo course will introduce you to some words, but like I said, it will introduce you to words that if you try to read the Bible, or if you try to translate like a Latin prayer, it might not work because the words aren't exactly the same. But if you're just looking to sort of play around and make some good use of your time to learn some Latin words, yeah, stuff like Duolingo is helpful, right? So that's okay. Okay, let's see. Any other questions here? Any other questions? Note also that we have Greek classes, so if you'd like to learn ancient Greek as well, what I'd recommend is get started in Latin, get through a few lessons, and then if you want to start learning Greek, if you have some Latin already known, Greek is actually very easy. You're welcome for the meetings. I'm happy to have these meetings as long as students show up for them. Johanni, and again, I don't know if that's how you pronounce that name, and I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, but you asked, why did Latin language become a dead language? When we say Latin is a dead language, what we mean is that it's not actively used anymore, and so the vocabulary isn't growing. That's what it means to be a dead language. So for example, if we think about, the word smartphone, there's no Latin word for smartphone because the language isn't used actively anymore. And so when new things are developed, the vocabulary isn't growing. So we get into some awkward thing. Giovanni, okay, with the silent H. Hope I got that right, Giovanni. Okay, so it's called a dead language because number one, it's not actively used, and number two, the vocabulary isn't keeping up with modern developments. So we get into some awkward situations where we have to look things up or try to make up words or just use English words that don't have an English translation. You'll see Spanish people do this sometimes. Spanish people who are learning English, they'll speak with English words and then they'll come to an English word that there's no Spanish word for, like a word like internet, right? They'll say, blah, 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 blah in Spanish, and then all of a sudden you'll hear them say internet, and it sounds funny, but it's because they might not have a Spanish word and they just use the English word. So we'd have to do that. We'd have to do that in Latin too. What is the order to do Greek courses? The same as Latin. So start with Greek reading, get through a few Greek reading lessons, then start Greek grammar, okay? And there will be a Greek vocabulary course, just like the Latin vocabulary course. I don't know if I've made that available yet, but there will be. What will the next meeting be talking about? We'll probably continue into the next lesson, and we'll always do some Latin reading work because it helps the new students and it gives the older students some review. But what I'll do in these lessons is I'll talk about some details of the Latin that's not in the lessons and try to explain things a little more. So I'll give you a little more insight into the language that will be helpful. So we'll just add some more information than I could put in a written lesson, okay? Is there a live class tomorrow? No, not as of right now. I'm willing to do a Greek class, but I need to know that students are interested in it. As of right now, I don't think many students are interested in it. And I know one or two might say they're interested, but that's not a class. All right, any other questions? And you can ask questions about Latin reading or about grammar or about vocabulary. Just any questions you have that relate to Latin. I'm happy to talk about anything. I've been studying this stuff a long time, so you can ask me just about anything, I think, by this point. All right, Margaret, thanks for coming. Any other questions? If not, we're going to wrap up, get back to work. All right, it looks like questions up. Here we go. Sarah asked, do Latin studies help us study other languages as well? Yes, definitely. And this is the kind of thing that I'll show you in our meetings. So first of all, obviously, many English words are derived from Latin and from Greek. So when you study Latin and Greek, you're also learning the meanings of English words as well. And obviously not easy English words, but sometimes you're reading something, especially if you're reading things that are challenging, and you'll come across big words that you can't figure out the meaning of. For example, I'll type one in the chat. Look at this word that I typed in the chat. Can you see it? Oh, sorry, I didn't type it yet. 1 second. There you go. You see that word? So you come across a word like this in something that you're reading, and you're like, what in the world does that mean? I have no idea what that means. Well, if you know classical Latin, you can sort of figure it out, even if you've never seen it before. Now, some of you might know what the word X means in Latin. What does X mean? Does anybody know what X means? Anybody? It means out of. Okay, so we know what the X part means. It means out of, and then we've got this crescens part. Well, if you study Latin, you'll learn the verb, the Latin verb crescere or crescere means to grow. So what does excrescens mean? What does excrescens mean? To grow out of. That's right. So that's what. So for example, a horn on an animal's head is an excrescens. It's a part of the body that grows out of their skull. So you can just see how you might come across a word in English when you're reading, like excrescens, and you would have no idea what that meant. But if you know Latin, you'd be able to figure it out. Okay, you could say, well, I don't know what it means, but I have a good idea what it means. And then you can see if that makes sense in what you're reading. And if it makes sense, then you're probably right. So it's very helpful for other languages, especially English, but even others like French and Spanish. You'll see the same thing. You might see if you're learning Spanish, you might see a Spanish word. And you may say, well, I've never studied that Spanish word before, but I know Latin and I can sort of see some pieces of that word that come from Latin, and you can take a good guess. Okay. So it is helpful. Invincible, very good. That's a good example. Let's look at that real quick, right? So we have this word invincible. Okay, invincible. The first, and we break it up into parts. So look at the end, we have the ending IBLE. What does that mean? In Latin, that would be the ending ibilis. What does that mean? What does the ibil ending at the end mean? Take a guess. You can take a guess. There's no grading here or anything. Take a guess. What does that mean? Able to. Very good. Okay. And then we have at the beginning, we have a prefix in. Now, we just saw the word in, and it meant in Latin, but that's not what this means. It means not. Okay. Very good. And we have to figure out, why does the word in mean not? We'll learn that in grammar. Okay. So we have not and we have able. So not able to, and then we've got this word in the middle. We've got vinci or vinch, right? Vinci. Now, this is a little complicated because if we look it up in a dictionary, we'll find that the verb vincere means to defeat. So what does invincible mean? Invincible. Not able to kill, okay, that's all right, but what does it mean more exactly? Invincible, not able to defeat, right? So if there's some the best team in the league, for example, no one can beat them, we say that team is invincible, right? Is not able to be defeated. Okay, so you can just see how, if you learn the classical languages and you learn how English words are formed, even if you see a word unconquerable, that's good. If you see a word that you've never seen before, you don't just throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, I never learned that, but you think about it and try to figure it out so that you can at least take a good guess. And then you can see if your guess works in the passage you're reading. And if it works, if it seems like it makes sense, you're probably right. Now that becomes very helpful later on in your studies. Like if you go on to take the SAT test to get ready for college. I don't know if you do that in England or what they do in England, but in America we have tests that we take to prove that we're ready for college studies. You'll run into stuff like this all the time on an SAT test where you've got to read things, and sometimes having that knowledge of classical languages helps you to understand a passage or a word that other students wouldn't be able to understand. I see somebody wrote most dinosaurs have Latin names. Yeah, because we've got to think of a name. Okay. So for example, to think of a dinosaur, let's look at this name, Tyrannosaurus rex, right? You've got this word Tyrannosaurus rex. We could put that together with Latin. What does the word rex mean in Latin? Yeah, I didn't think you had SATs in England. I'm sure you have something else though. Rex means king. Good. So obviously, Tyrannosaurus Rex identifies that dinosaur as the king. And then we've got Tyrannosaurus. So you can see, again, I don't want to get into all these stuff, but you can see how you can at least get an idea of what an unfamiliar word means. And then, of course, if you get really skilled in the language, you can be more exact. Okay. So that's it. So GCSE, I guess E stands for some kind of examination. So yeah, every country has their own standardized tests. We have SATs here. All right, so that's good. So any other questions? And obviously we could continue these discussions for eternity, right? Because there's so much to talk about. But one of the limiting factors is going to be your own knowledge of the language. So the only way that you can really figure this stuff out is to study the language. We could talk about Latin all the time, but really we have to do the work and study the language, and then we can answer lots of these questions for ourselves. All right. So anything else before we wrap up? The next live class, yeah, will be Sacred Scripture on Monday. So we'll do Sacred Scripture on Monday, Aesop Fables on Tuesday, and Latin on Wednesday. And then if there's lots of interest in something else, maybe we'll add another class, or maybe we'll just wait till next term. We'll start after Christmas. But if you guys are interested in classes, and the other thing too is you have to get lessons done, right? You can't just sit on live classes. It's not a TV show. If you're in live classes, but you're not actually getting lessons done and you're not getting assignments submitted, you're really not doing anything. So I really want to make sure that students are getting things done. If I see you on live class, every day you're in the live class meeting, but when I grade assignments, I don't see any assignments from you. Eventually, I'm going to tell you that you should get out of the live class and go do some assignments, because that's what live classes are for. So, it's usually like kids that I see messages from and kids I see on the forum are not the same kids that I see when I'm grading assignments. So I want to see your names in the assignments every week. So make sure you're getting work done. Every time when I talk to my kids, my kids also study, I yell at them, I say, get tasks done, right? Don't waste time with all kinds of different activities. Get the tasks done, get assignments submitted, get quizzes completed, keep getting tasks done, okay? Elementary geometry, I doubt that I'm going to make videos for geometry. Mathematics is something we need to talk about eventually. I would like to do some math courses, because I know how important math courses are for everyone's high school studies and things like that. We'll see. We have to always make scheduling things. So we'll see. If you make requests and there's lots of interest, I'll send out a message to everybody and say that I'm willing to do a class at this time. And if I get lots of registrations, then we'll do it. If there's not many registrations, then we won't do it. And if I don't get many live class registrations, sometimes I'll just make videos and post them that you can watch on your own. All right. So I have a couple different ways of doing these things. Live classes, I like to have live classes where kids can join us, whether they're far along in a course or just new. So some subjects don't work like that. Like math doesn't work like that, because if you're on lesson 30 and another student is on lesson 1, there's really nothing to talk about. Some classes like Aesop's Fables, anybody can join us and have an interesting class. So it also depends on the classes. All right. Are there any live classes on history? No, because that would take forever, right? It takes a long time to study history. You've just got to read through lessons. Fortunately, history reading is usually pretty quick, but it's hard to have a history lesson because there's just so much content. But we could do history classes. We'll see. We'll see what the interest is. But yeah, they take a long time because there's so much to talk about. All right, any other questions? I think we're going to wrap up for today. If anything else pops up, just send it to me by email, or you can post questions on the course forums, but make sure if you post anything on the course forums, make sure it's just about the course lessons. Don't start any private conversations, personal conversations on the course forums, because when you post on the course forum, you might not know this, but when you post on the course forum, everybody in the course gets a message. So if you post, hi, Mr. Michael, I like your shirt, you just sent out a message to everybody in the class, and so make sure if you post a question on the forum, it's about a lesson, and maybe it's something that another student can help you with, or maybe it's a question that I'll answer and the answer will be helpful to other students. So think about other students if you post on the course forum. If you have a personal question, just send me an email, okay? So that's it for today. Thanks for a good class. Thanks for helping me with the translation work, and we'll meet again next week. So get your tasks done, get assignments done, get quizzes done. You can study forever, but when you're all finished, colleges and universities, they're going to want to see tasks completed. So you've got to show them that you're doing work by getting tasks finished. You've got to give me stuff. I'd like to help your parents prepare transcripts for you in the future and stuff like that, but you've got to give me something to work with. I've got to have assignments and quizzes, or else I can't really say anything. I can't say, oh yeah, Tommy's a real nice kid, period. I don't know anything about his work. I need to see work. So get assignments in. Even if they're not perfect, you can always continue working on them, but you've got to get stuff turned in. So try to focus on getting tasks done, because you can waste time forever. So that's all for today. I'll catch you guys next week. Let me know if you have any questions. God bless everybody. Yes, I'll check the quiz out. All right, signing off. God bless.